السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا كثيرا ونحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad. We begin in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I hope and pray all of you are well. We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hamdan kathiran, by a multitude of all praises, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us in our gathering here today. Now this inshallah is the episode 3 of our study of the Crusades, and so we've been doing this alhamdulillah for the last 2 weeks. And just as a very, very short recap for those who may not have been here for the first 2 weeks, we began, if you remember, by looking at the church history to begin with. We spoke about the situation in the Roman Church and then divisions with the Byzantine Church. We spoke about the situation in medieval Europe at that time, the role of the clergy, the importance of Christian sites, pilgrimage. We spoke about Al-Andalus in Spain and the beginning of the Spanish Inquisition, the Reconquista. We spoke about how the church was invested in this idea of retaking important parts of Al-Andalus. In fact, some of the earliest crusader motivated ideas or motifs, in fact, are coming from their interest in Al-Andalus in Spain. We spoke about Gregory the Seventh. In fact, of course, he was one of them in the idea of retaking the state of Zaragoza from the Muslims. And then, of course, Urban II later on, 1089, and the retaking or protecting of the Church of Tarragona. And then we kind of had this big discussion about the idea of the indulgence. We spoke about why that was important for Christians who seeking martyrdom or traveling or taking Jerusalem from the Muslims, the way that Urban II really packaged this so effectively by promising them an indulgence. An indulgence was this idea that they no longer had to or had to worry that the forgiveness that they sought from God would be not fully complete only through a confession to a priest. It wasn't absolution that was necessary only, because that wasn't enough anymore. They needed a penitentia. They needed a physical, temporal punishment as a way of atoning for their sins, and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the military pilgrimage, could fulfill that. And second, of course, the idea that was really popular in this time, in the 10th, 11th century, was the idea of purgatory. And so Urban II, he really packaged this incentive for the crusade, for the armed military pilgrimage, very effectively. And it appealed to a lot of people because he was really addressing his sermon, his speech, to people who were not only clergy. In fact, the clergy was not allowed to participate in the crusade. He forbade monks from making preparations for the crusade. He only wanted the knightly class to travel, so therefore they would have experience in fighting. And second to that, of course, were people who had engaged in fighting against other Christians, in sins and crime and robbery and theft and all of these things. And he wanted, therefore, that through being motivated to travel to Jerusalem, they could find atonement, and it would appeal to them because they need their sins forgiven. And so it was a big thing. I mean, it kind of really appealed to them. And then what he did is he traveled personally to important places. He traveled to Bordeaux on his campaign to call people to the crusade. He traveled to Tours. Tours, of course, we discussed was important because of 732 and the defeat of the army of Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi by Charles Martel. And remember, of course, that people had already been on pilgrimage. It's very likely that those who had traveled to the crusade, from 1096 onwards, had already been on pilgrimage. Like they've been either to Jerusalem before as a pilgrim, or they've been to Rome, or they've been to the Santiago. In fact, the Santiago de Compostela in Al-Andalus in Spain is extremely significant because of something that happened in 997. In fact, that site became important not only through the eyes of the Reconquista, the Spanish, the Reconquest and Inquisition in Spain, but also in the Crusade. Because in the Santiago de Compostela in 997, what happened is that the Hajib, which is a Chamberlain, Al-Mansur, Ibn Abi Amir Al-Mansur, who was the de facto ruler, really, he used to make these campaigns in the north to push back the Christians who were coming now from the north, from the mountains of Asturias and Galicia, and taking the states, Muslim states. In fact, they're building their kingdoms of Leon and Castile and Navarre. But once, in 997, he goes and launches a raid in the Santiago de Compostela, and that's where Christians believed remain the site that contains the remains of James, called the brother of the Lord in the Bible, and so when he went there, he took the the bells from the church, and he transported them to the Masjid of Cordoba in Cordoba in Spain, and they were used as lamps in the great mosque of Cordoba, and it really became like it was seen as an affront. And so James, this the saint, was transformed in their minds as James Matamoros, James the murderer or the Moor slayer, the slayer of the Moors, and the Moors was a name given to Muslims of Spain. It just shows, therefore, that how the single site became transformed in their mind, and thereafter it became a really intense site of pilgrimage to go to the Santiago. And interestingly enough, that when in 1492, when the armies of Ferdinand Isabella came to take Granada from the Muslims, they came with the flags of the Santiago de Compostela. So it's interesting. So the whole idea was that these crusaders now, who have already been on pilgrimages to places like Rome, to Santiago, to Jerusalem, therefore they were used to it. And therefore what Urban did is that he forbade the monks and the clergy from traveling to the crusade. It was not supposed to be for them. It was supposed to be for the knightly class, and also we spoke about the idea that was really popular in this time, that was in fact emphasized through Urban II's councils in Piacenza in March of 1095 in the north of Italy, and then in Clermont again, which was to promote this Cluniac monasticism. And that was tied in with this idea of the peace of God, or the truce of God movement. And what really laid at the heart of that movement was the idea that Christians are not to harm other Christians and not to harm the clergy. There should be a sense of peace between them. And so the crusade, in fact, tapped into this idea, because it meant kind of as a way of restoring a goodly divine order of being, as opposed to sowing corruption. This is why you'll notice in the letters that we'll see today of Urban II, he's speaking to the knightly classes and saying, this blood spilling that you've been engaged in for so long against fellow Christians, now just turn it towards the common enemy, there in Jerusalem, i.e. the Muslims, And so we spoke about these kind of things, in the previous episodes, until we get to the point where we're looking at the Byzantine Empire. And so we're looking at Alexius Comnenus and his appeal to Pope Urban II, asking for military assistance against the Seljuks. The Seljuks are a rising power. The Seljuks are controlling, north of Syria, and and that's a big trouble for the Byzantines, because you've had a crushing defeat in the Battle of Manzikert in 1074, and they're really growing in strength. Although saying that, we should remember that they were also quite embroiled in this military struggle with the Fatimids, the Fatimid Ismailis, whose power base was in Egypt, and that was in fact, I think that was one of the problems, because it meant that there couldn't be a strong resistance against the Crusaders, militarily, in those days specifically, because the Seljuks already were very much tied up in military spending against their conflicts with the Fatimids, of Egypt. So what was happening, therefore, is that as the crusade was being launched, you could say, and the sermons and the preaching were going ahead, there was a lack of control. I mean, there had to be, because it was quite organic and it was a spontaneous growth, from the Christian world. It was very difficult for control. I mean, you couldn't control the camps, the Crusader camps. You couldn't control. This is why you had many knights who traveled with peasants and peasants who traveled with others. Simply because if people simply felt that they were on a crusade, they were going to go on the crusade. And as long as they were making a vow, for the crusade, and they were going in the name of Jesus, and they were going, for the atonement of sins, for indulgence, for forgiveness of their sins, then that would be classified in their hearts, of course, as a crusade. And so that's how it happened, in the early stages. Urban II himself is making these very personal traveling expeditions to important sites, and he would in fact choose important dates, which were like the days of celebrating the feast of saints. And so in these celebratory days in venerating the saints, where people would gather for feasts, a lot of people were expected, and so great crowds would emerge. And Urban II would use those occasions to attract largest audiences, so therefore he could deliver his messages. And it really had a very, very popular effect. And a lot of people, rallied behind the call and sought to travel to Jerusalem. Now, one thing, of course, was, Alexis Comnenus' letter to him, and that was a motivation. We went through the account of Fulcrum of Charts last time, in his account of the speech of Urban II. And you would have noticed, for those of us who were here last week, that there was no mention, in fact, in his speech of Jerusalem. And although, now that's very interesting, because it shows how, and remember, of course, these speeches were written much later, all right, much later. And so although some may have been eyewitnesses to Urban II's speech, in being written so much later, sometimes, many years after the taking of Jerusalem, the entirety of the speech was colored, by that success in the First Crusade. But in his case, of course, from the Gesta Francorum, from the Deeds of the Franks by the monk, it was more as a rescuing of other Christians in other parts of the world. Urban II, of course, used it to his advantage, because he could promote the supremacy, if you like, of the Catholic Church over the Orthodox Church. And this was also very, very important, as we discussed last time, because of the schism, of 1054 between the Catholics and the Eastern Church, but also because, and this was, I think, even more, perhaps even bigger, because he wanted to really, really establish this sense of the militia, Christi, meaning there had to be kind of a militia secularis, the sacred battle. Crusaders were militia Christi, they were soldiers of Christ. That had to become so clear over and above the militia secularis, like the secular struggle, the one for the regnum, the one for the king. And although the indulgence had been given before, just like Urban was given and giving in 1095, had been given by Alexander II, had been given by Henry II, what made it complicated is the fact that, for example, in I think in 1036 it was, Henry II fought against the Hungarians, and when he did that, he promised the soldiers an indulgence, right? So if you did it, you'd have full forgiveness of all of your sins. Now that's just exactly the same as Urban II is giving for these crusaders going to Jerusalem. But the key difference was this, that when he gave the indulgence, Henry II, to the people fighting against the Hungarians, he even came, with I think Pope Benedict IX. He called him to come with the flags of Saint Peter. And it was very much a secular battle. It was a secular fight. It was a fight for empire. It wasn't a fight for religion. But he of course, he used it, for expediency for himself, because it could really be appealing to people seeking that forgiveness, and of course they will be motivated by that because they believe in it. Urban II, of course, didn't want this to happen again. He wanted it simply and solely to be a struggle on religious terms, and not have the involvement of the secular authorities or empires. And this is why in the First Crusade there was no king that traveled for the crusade. It was sought to be very much a religious expedition. And I think perhaps this is one of the reasons why the Muslim world didn't see that fully coming, because although they had expected, they'd been in struggles with the Byzantines for so long, and there's been fighting across the empire against the Byzantines, the very strong religious element behind the crusade was something that they weren't really expecting. Now, what made it very difficult, and this is very key for us to mention at this point, I think, is that in 1095, when the crusade was being launched by Urban II, I want us to just go back a few years. And so look at what's happening in the Muslim world. In 1092, that's 3 years before the announcement or the call for the crusade, 1092, the Seljuk Wazir Nizam al-Mulk dies, right? In fact, he is murdered. Nizam al-Mulk. Nizam al-Mulk was extremely powerful. He was in fact the de facto ruler of parts of Syria, Palestine, and so he is extremely important, and he's been ruling for about 30 years. 30 years he's been ruling. Nizam al-Mulk, an amazing individual, so strong and respected and feared, and so he's murdered in 1092. 1 month after him being murdered, the Seljuk Sultan himself, Malik Shah, who's been ruling for 20 odd years, dies, right? So in 1 year, just a few months apart, the most important rulers from the Sunni side have both died, right, in 1092. And then if you move forward to 1094, 2 years after that, the Fatimid Khalif, right, al-Mustansir, he dies, the Fatimid Khalif. And then within a month or so, the Fatimid Wazir Badr al-Jamali, he also dies. And then a month or so after him, the Sunni Khalif al-Muqtadi, he dies. And that's 5 or 6 extremely important Muslim rulers who have been ruling for decades, all died. And and you think to yourself, the crusade therefore was probably launched at the most opportunistic, at the most advantageous time it could have been for them, because it meant the Muslim world was really in this political turmoil, right? And so even when the Crusaders arrived, there was the Malik Shah, the Seljuk Sultan, he had 2 sons, Muhammad and Barak Yaruk, and there's a power struggle between them. There's struggle between the Seljuks and the Fatimids. There's Fatimid issues that they're facing called the Nizari schism. Again based upon two sons. Who's supposed to be the rightful heir to that power, and so and then on top of all of this, the Sunni and the Shia division. And so there's so much of this division that's really making the Muslim world quite entangled in these disputes and divisions and difficulties. And so when the Crusaders arrived, they really arrived at a time that was really advantageous for them, to their benefit, because they could play on these divisions, and it meant therefore that if military, if there is if there are other struggles that people are involved with, on the Eastern Front, i.e. the Seljuks, then it's going to mean that there wouldn't be that much of a focus towards alleviating difficulties in Jerusalem. Saying this, however, I would emphasize that even if you take someone like the great Yusuf ibn Tashufin was the one from the Murabitun, from the Maghrib. He was the one that the Muslims of Al-Andalus, who were the Syrians, kept calling. They called him in fact 3 times, and on the 2 first occasions they called him for assistance against the Christians of the north who were coming down, and he would bring his armies and his mercenaries, and they would fight the Christians back. On the 3rd time he remained, he decided to stay there. He fought against these the divisive elements in the Muluk al-Tawa'if, in the party kingdoms, and then he remained there for some time, seeking to re-establish this sense of Muslim unity. Yusuf ibn Tashufin was sent some ships to the port of Jerusalem, seeking to provide assistance to the Muslims, facing the first crusade. But his ships didn't arrive in time. It's a reflection, therefore, that the Muslims, of course, in that capacity, in some capacity, were able to provide assistance, to the Muslims stranded in Jerusalem. And also, of course, you also have the Fatimids. The Fatimids, the Fatimids just took Jerusalem from the Seljuks a year or something before the Crusaders even arrived. There's some historical speculation based upon a single account, that the Byzantines informed the Muslims that the Franks were coming to Jerusalem. It's very it's very odd, really, because there's only one single account that remains like this, and we do question about who those Muslims were. It's likely, if it's going to be the Fatimids, could explain in some way, maybe. It's a far-fetched, but it could be an explanation for why the Fatimids quickly went and took Jerusalem, from the Sunnis, just before the Crusaders arrived. Was it a way of preempting the arrival of the Crusaders into Jerusalem? Allah knows best. It's hard for us to say, but you do have that single account. It could be a fabrication because it's only a single account, it's not attested by other sources, but in any case, it was the Fatimids, who were there just at the point of the Crusaders arriving into Jerusalem. Now, last time we looked at the account of Fulcher of Chartres, one of the 5 surviving accounts of the speech of Urban II. Each one has its own color, its own gloss. Each one has its own emphasis onto the speech. I'm just going to now try and move this forward. So here we are. Okay, now if you can read with me, we're on the account of Robert the monk. This is Robert of Reims, and this is his account of the speech of Urban II. And so Robert of Reims, as you can see, Robert perhaps 25 years after the speech, but he may have been present at the council. He used I don't think it was 25 years after the speech. I think it was some years after the speech, but in any case, it's going to be I think it was 7 or 8 years, if I remember, after Urban's speech. He claims to be an eyewitness, at the Council of Clermont in 1095, where Urban delivered his speech. It's difficult to know, I guess, but what he does do is he really gives us a very interesting, reflection of the importance of Jerusalem. And also his speech is quite colored by eschatological language. And that's something quite important, the theme of eschatology. I think inshallah next week when we get to the Muslim response to the First Crusade, you'll also see something quite similar about the way that eschatology had a very, very strong significance, quite ingrained into the public consciousness and the minds of both Christians and Muslims in seeking to explain the events that have just been unfolding. And so, for example, in 1094, I think 95, you had two lunar eclipses, and the Christians, when they saw these, they sought to explain them along the lines of, well, something big is about to happen. You also had meteor showers, and they used the meteor showers again as an explanation that something big is about to happen. For the Muslims, they were about to enter into a new century, and that was seen as something that was heralding something important about to happen. And you'll see one of my essays in my master's, in fact, was about eschatology, in the Islamic or struggle against the Crusaders. And there are many things you could discuss about. I mean, inshallah, I'll save it. I won't mention too much now, but inshallah, maybe at the next episode. So I'm just going to try and get this going. So this here is the okay, let me move this slightly so you can clearly see it, inshallah. This is the account of there we are. If I just make my one slightly smaller, there we are. Move this a bit, there we are. Okay, now we can see it. So if you read with me, I'll read also. We can try and make sense of this. I'll just highlight some parts of it in the beginning first. Okay, here we are. So he says, this is his account of the speech of Urban II. He claims to be an eyewitness, but it's colored by the capture of Jerusalem, because it's post 1099, and so you have to bear that in mind. But just pay attention to the language, to the imagery he's using. He says, "O race of Franks, race from across the mountains, race chosen and beloved by God, as shines forth in very many ways, very many of your works, set apart from all nations by the situation of your country." Therefore, he's projecting this crusade as a kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. He's projecting it as something that's like a blessing from God, because that means those who are going to go in it are the ones who are select and chosen by God for this task. And so, why wouldn't you want to be part of that great race of Franks and chosen, beloved by God, and you're the ones who are going to do it, as well as by your Catholic faith. Notice that's very important, because remember he's of course appealing to Alexis Comnenus's letter and supporting the Byzantine Church, but and he's calling them, have to help our brethren. He calls them our brethren, our brothers. But he's also using the crusade as a way of showing the supremacy of the Catholic faith over and above the Orthodox one, because it's the Catholics ones who are responding to the plight of the Christians of Jerusalem and fighting the Muslims. And so he really wants to use that. So it's interesting that this comes across very early in Robert of Reims' account of his speech, as well as by your Catholic faith and the honor of the Holy Church. There we are. Church meaning the Catholic Church. To you our discourse is addressed, and for you our exhortation is intended. We wish you to know that a grievous cause has led us to your country. What peril threatening you and all the faithful has brought us. All right. Then he says, from the confines of Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople. Therefore, that's the first mention we're having, therefore, of Jerusalem. In the previous speech, there was no mention of Jerusalem. Now we have both Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople. A horrible tale has gone forth and very frequently has been brought to our ears, namely, that a race from the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, a generation forsooth which has not directed its heart and has not entrusted its spirit to God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage and fire. Alright, so this is really crazy language. Brandon Tarrant, who committed the horrific killings of countless Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand last year, in the Great Manifesto, this short text that he wrote, he quotes Urban II's speech at length. I think he even quotes this part, from the account of Robert of Reims, Robert the monk. He mentions this part of it as well as justification for his terrorist, barbaric, savage acts of murder against the Muslims of New Zealand. Inshallah, there is a book coming out soon, inshallah, very, very quickly, very soon, inshallah, just in a few weeks, called On Being Human, How Islam Addresses Othering, Dehumanization and Empathy through I-era, inshallah, and that will be something for all of us to reflect on. And I speak about this speech and also Brandon Tarrant's a text, the Great Manifesto. Anyway, now there's something we should mention, because like last time we spoke about the Al-Hakam II's destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Christian accounts paint this in a very, very graphic terms, that he razed the church and he even destroyed the tomb, what they allege to be the tomb of Jesus, where they say Jesus was died and when he was buried for 3 days 3 nights. Of course, Muslims, we don't believe that, but that's what they believe. And he destroyed. It wasn't just the Church of Holy Sepulchre. It was also other smaller sites. He destroyed Jewish sites of significance, and it was seen as quite a kind of a holistic destruction of the sites of the dhimmis, of those who are Ahl al-Dhimma, citizens of the state, and they're paying the jizya, and of course it's very un-Islamic thing to do, because in Umar's letter, in fact, in Jerusalem, the Pact of Umar is a good indication, because Umar said in his pact that there should be no destruction of any churches, of any crucifixes, or any sites of importance, significance, meaning they have protection in that sense. But there may be a room for us to try and understand why he even did those things, and historians have speculated why. Some they say that because he was seeking to limit the power of the Christians. At that time, he was seeking to enforce a sense of control and authority. Some they say that he wanted to show that the only religion allowed in this place is going to be, the Islam, and the Fatim, the Shia, understanding of that. Some they say that it was alleged that he had become a Christian or something, and so he did that as a way of proving the others that, look, I haven't become Christian because look at what I'm doing to the Christian sites. And it's difficult for us, to know, what his precise motivation, for that was. But the other reason why that really doesn't seem to work too well is because from 1030 to 1036, the Byzantine Emperor Michael the Ninth, I think it was, Philologon, rebuilt the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he fixed up the things that had been destroyed, and that's 1032, 1036. So if you think about it, that's 1009 the church was destroyed by Al-Hakam II, and then that's 25 odd years after that, the Byzantine Michael the Ninth, or Michael the Fourth, I can't remember, 9th or the 4th, he rebuilt the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, fixed up, and then in 1095, that's many decades after that, 6 decades at least after that, Urban II is saying that these people have destroyed the churches of God. So it's kind of it's not that likely. Although, of course, saying that the pilgrims who would travel to Jerusalem from Europe had a lot of these kind of tales about mistreatment, from some Muslims attacking their caravans, pilgrimage, and the churches being destroyed. And so depending on when this information reached them back home and who it's reaching and how they're kind of using this as a way of justifying the expedition to fight the Muslims in Jerusalem is all extremely insightful. And then he says, as you can see, so he says they're a cursed race utterly alienated from God, generation forsooth, which invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. Or none of it. This is not true. He has led away a part of the captives into its own country, and a part of it has destroyed by cruel tortures. That has either entirely destroyed the churches of God, or appropriated them for the rites of its own religion. They destroy the altars after having defiled them with their uncleanness. Okay, so this is just kind of exaggerated, hyperbolic language he's using to really create a sense of outrage in the Christian minds about, look what's just happened in Jerusalem and other places. These Muslims, kind of an othered species, dehumanized, savage monsters, have done all these terrible things to the Christian sites of significance. He's really building up to that. He said they circumcised the Christians. Crazy. And the blood of the circumcisions they either spread upon the altars or pour into the vases of the baptismal font. Unbelievable. So you can clearly see the language. If you imagine, when Christians are hearing this, and these are knights. Although there was so many, in Clermont, what did you have? You had, 80. What was it? 80. So you had 13 archbishops, right? 80 bishops and cardinals, 90 abbots. So you have a lot of Christian clergy there. But they're not the only ones who had that speech. This speech is being disseminated, person to person. And even on his traveling expeditions, he's saying many other things at the same time. And all of this is coming together. So remember, of course, that if this is written so well after the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, this is really like the justification. If the ones that we fought against did all these terrible things, it should validate, should provide some legitimacy and exonerate us, for that capture of Jerusalem, because this is what those Muslims over there, did to us. And so, just read that again. They circumcised the Christians, and the blood of the circumcision they either spread upon the altars or pour into the vases of the baptismal font. When they wish to torture people by a base death, they perforate their navels. Alright, it's unbelievable. And dragging forth the extremity of the intestines, bind it to a stake, then with flogging they lead the victim around until the viscera, having gushed forth, the victim falls prostrate upon the ground. It's crazy. And it sounds like, again, they're like some kind of an alien, barbaric, heathen race of beasts would do something, as crazy and as horrific as that. Others they bind to a post and pierce with arrows. Others they compel to extend their necks, and then, attacking them with naked swords, attempt to cut through the neck with a single blow. What shall I say of the abominable rape of the women? To speak of it is worse than to be silent. The kingdom of the Greeks is now dismembered by them, right? That's the Seljuks, okay? And deprived of territory so vast in extent that it cannot be traversed in a march of 2 months. So this is really harking back to Manzikert in 1071. And so, on whom therefore is the labor of avenging these wrongs and of recovering this territory encumbered, if not upon you, right? So you can imagine, I mean, this is crazy talk. You upon whom above other nations God has conferred remarkable glory in arms, great courage, boldly activity. So these are, he's speaking to knights who are used to fighting and killing other people, and he's saying, you're the ones who are chosen. You have great courage, you have arms, you have bodily activity and strength to humble the hairy scalp of those who resist you. Right? So you can clearly see how evocative, how emotive, those words were. Let the deeds of your ancestors move you and incite your minds to manly achievements. And so that's something very important. I mean, the idea of kind of your glorious ancestors, you were once once upon a time, and follow in the footsteps of your fathers. This is a very key theme, particularly in the Second Crusade, in a very important Crusader papal bull called the what is it called again? It's called I just slipped my mind, subhanAllah. It was a very important papal bull carried by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and the idea of honoring your fathers and following the ways of your fathers, protecting the legacy of your fathers, was one of the central themes in that Crusader papal bull, and so that's coming across here as well. So let the deeds of your ancestors move you and incite your minds to... it's called the Quantum Predecessors. We call it QP, Quantum Predecessors. That's the papal name of the papal bull that was carried, from the Pope to Urban II, and he became the main kind of a preacher of this papal bull, the Quantum Predecessor. Anyway, the glory and greatness of King Charles the Great and of his son Louis, and of your other kings who have destroyed the kingdoms of the pagans and have extended in these lands the territory of the Holy Church. Let the Holy Sepulchre, there we are, first mention now of the Holy Sepulchre, a great incentive. That's the main thing. That's called the Mater Ecclesiae, that's the Mother Church. Let the Holy Sepulchre of the Lord, our Saviour, which is possessed by unclean nations, i.e. Muslims, especially incite you, and the holy places which are now treated with ignominy and irreverently polluted with their filthiness. O most valiant soldiers and descendants of invincible ancestors, be not degenerate, but recall the valor of your progenitors. And so you can clearly see, therefore, how he's really building up to this sense of outrage. That you have to respond to the outrage because, you're valiant and you're brave and you're sons of great Christians before you have done amazing feats of conquest and capturing territory and defending the faith. And you too can be as great as them if you also made that same sacrifice. And why wouldn't you make the sacrifice if such heinous things are being done, to your fellow brethren in that part of the world? And this is really the main thrust of his message. He then says, but if you are hindered by love of children, parents and wives, remember what the Lord says in the gospel. He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Every one that hath forsaken houses or brethren or sisters or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life. Meaning, don't be encumbered by your children and wives, because this is far greater and of importance than that. So let none of your possessions detain you, no solicitude for your family affairs, since this land which you inhabit, shut in on all sides by the seas and surrounded by the mountains, peaks, is too narrow for your large population, nor does it abound to wealth, and it furnishes scarcely food enough for its cultivators, right? And therefore he's kind of saying similar stuff here. Here we are. So if you carry on reading, enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre. Right, there you can see there, meaning make the pilgrimage, So Crusaders, of course, Crusaders had to be marked with the cross, had to travel with the pilgrim staff. They went as Peregrini Milite Christi. These were pilgrim knights of Christ. And he says, enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. I mean, that's your land. That land which, which as the scripture says, floweth with milk and honey. Now this is interesting, because that reference from the Bible, that it floweth with milk and honey, means that, for many crusaders, the incentive would have been a monetary one. It would have been one, the idea is that if he's saying that the land of Jerusalem, Palestine, is a land of milk and honey, that means there is a material benefit for you to go and travel to that land. I mean, it's something you can live in that land and really take advantage of its produce. That means, therefore, that many, of course, and there were, of course, many who traveled there simply, for secular reasons, for irreligious reasons, perhaps, and going there for other reasons. So it was given by God into the possession of the children of Israel. Jerusalem is a navel of the world. Now that's a very important line. Jerusalem is a navel of the world, and it's just reinforcing the Christian connection to the Holy Land, really the sanctity of Jerusalem, navel of the world, meaning it's the most important place on earth. The land is fruitful above others, like another paradise of delights. The Redeemer, Jesus, of the human race, has made glorified by burial. Okay, so this is again connecting to what was believed, from 325 and Constantine's mother's discovery, of the site where it was believed that Jesus was buried by Christians. And this, of course, was the temple of Jupiter, before. But she had this vision, I think it was a vision or it was a dream, where she believed that this is the exact location. Therefore, the temple was destroyed and the church was built. And within that, Calvary and the grotto, they found other things that they believed were also important, namely the part of the cross and the spear that they believed past Jesus, as Christians believe, and so this royal city, therefore situated at the center of the world, is now held captive by his enemies and is in subjection to those who do not know God, to the worship of the heathens. She seeks, therefore, and desires to be liberated. Notice that's notice the feminine pronoun there. She seeks. This is why Holy Sepulchre was called the Mother Church, Mater Ecclesiae, right? So she seeks, therefore, and desires to be liberated, and does not cease to implore you to come to her aid. From you especially she seeks succor, because, as we have already said, God has conferred upon you above all nations great glory in arms, right? So you're more than equipped, you're more than experienced, more than prepared. Accordingly, undertake the journey for the remission of your sins. There we are. That's the indulgence. And so if you do all of this, by the way, you have enough of an incentive to go and fight there. But if you do that extra super bonus, you have a full indulgence, a full remission of sins, with the assurance of the imperishable glory of the kingdom of heaven. And so there's no doubt about it. I mean, this is what he's saying. This is the Pope. The Pope is infallible in issues of dogma. Catholics believe he is the like the voice of Jesus. I mean, he's the representative of Jesus on earth, the most significant, after Jesus. And so therefore, if he's saying all of this, and then he's saying forgiveness, and then he's saying heaven, that's like a big thing, And so when Pope Urban had said these and very many similar things in his Urbane Discourse, the so influenced to one purpose, the desires of all were present, that they cried out, "It is a will of God." Now, it is a will of God in Latin is Deus vult, Deus vult, D-E-U-S-V-U-L-T, Deus vult. And Deus vult was the rallying cry as the Christians came and plundered Jerusalem, and they did such horrific, extreme acts of of violence against the inhabitants of that city, killing men, women, and children, the rallying cry was Deus vult, God wills it, God wills it. And it's quite interesting, by the way, that Deus vult in Spanish is Dios la quiere, Dios la quiere. And in the Spanish Inquisition, you know, when you had this text that was written by Nicholas Emerick, called the Directorium Inquisitorium, the guide to the Inquisitor. This really paved the way for the first Grand Inquisitor called Thomas de Torquemada. And Thomas de Torquemada, he was very, very extreme, you know, very harsh in anybody who did not abide by the tenets of the Trinity. I mean, the Trinity was a big thing. Therefore, focused towards Christians and Jews, that if any did not abide by the standards of believing in the Trinity as it was, as they understood it, is liable for the Inquisition. And he came up with that term of Dios la quiere, meaning God wills it, God wills it. And that's inspired by Urban II right here as we're reading. That's Deus vult, that's God wills it, God wills it. And then he says, when the venerable Roman pontiff heard that, with eyes uplifted, this is now Robert of Reims explaining, to heaven, he gave thanks to God, and with his hand commanding silence said, now he's continuing, most beloved brethren, today is manifest in you with what the Lord says in the gospel, where 2 or 3 are together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. Unless the Lord God had been present in your spirits, all of you would not have uttered the same cry. Right? So he's saying that's an account of the Spirit of God, you know. But even that, I mean, you can clearly kind of see that this is, you know, they've done the deed, they've done the evil killings and everything else in Jerusalem. Now, you know, from in hindsight, this is shaped, you know, by what happened then, and looking back then. And if he's saying that, you know, all of you would not have uttered the same cry unless the God had been present in you as spirits. For although the cry issued from numerous mouths, yet the origin of the cry was one. Therefore I say to you that God, who implanted this in your hearts, has drawn it forth from you. Therefore it's like, you know, let this then be your war cry in combat, because this word is given to you by God. When an armed attack is made upon the enemy, let this one be raised by all the soldiers of God. It is the will of God. It is the will of God. Meaning, Deus vult, God wills it, God wills it. So whatever, you know, sadistic act of violence you're perpetrating against other human beings, at the end of the day, Deus vult, God wills it, God wills it. And you will see in the accounts of other, you know, Crusader chronicles like Albert of Aachen, the kind of very horrific things that were done against the population, inhabitants of Jerusalem when the Crusaders arrived. And we do not command or advise that the old or feeble, or those unfit for bearing arms, undertake this journey, nor ought women to set out at all without their husbands or brothers or legal guardians. Right? So very, very strict. For such are more of a hindrance than aid, more of a burden than advantage. Let the rich aid the needy, and according to their wealth, let them take with them experienced soldiers. The priests and clerks of any order are not to go without the consent of their bishop, for this journey would profit them nothing if they went without permission of these. Can you see how he's really ensuring that this is under the control of the church? You know, this is not a matter involving the secular authorities, the emperor, nothing. This is just to do with the Pope organized everything. And remember the investiture controversy of previous decades, and how the whole struggle was about things like, simony, and things like investiture, who could invest, who could, who's allowed to depose of an emperor, what legal authority does an emperor even have, who's involved in the appointment of another pope. Is emperor included in that or not? And people like from the Reformed papacy were saying things like that's completely out of all bounds, that the emperor would have any say in anything. And this is why the whole conflict began, between the Emperor of Germany, Henry IV, and Pope Gregory VII. And remember, Urban II, this guy was his disciple. This was his disciple. This was like his right-hand man. He went to jail, went to prison, for him, because he had to promote his ideas. And so he's really, really going out of his way to really emphasize and stress that this is all to do with consent. You must take permission from your bishop, and this is a church kind of a hierarchy of authority. And so whoever therefore shall determine upon this holy pilgrimage, there we are, holy pilgrimage, peregrini, has to be seen as a pilgrimage because it needed some sanction from the Bible, and shall make this vow to God to that effect, and shall offer himself to him as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, shall wear this sign of the cross of the Lord on his forehead or on his breast, when truly having fulfilled his vow, he wishes to return, let him place the cross on his back between his shoulders. Such indeed by the twofold action will fulfill the precept of the Lord, as he commands in the gospel, he that forsaketh, he that taketh not his cross and follows after me, it is not worthy of me. Meaning he's saying, don't try and ever, come back once you've set out, for the journey. Therefore, I thought that was quite an interesting one, the account of Robert of Reims, Robert the monk, and you can clearly see a lot of that eschatological language, great mention of Jerusalem, Holy Sepulchre, great otherizing, dehumanizing of the enemy, in this case the Muslims, and really putting upon those who are present the sense of responsibility of traveling, to Jerusalem to take part in the crusade. And so that's extremely important for us to go through. Now I think we're coming to the end of the hour, and so I'm happy for us to call it a day, inshallah, from here. I would say, however, if there are any questions, then I'm happy to answer.
In this video, I'll show you how to set up and manage live streams in YouTube.
If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them, inshallah. So I'll just give it a second or so. Okay, if there's no questions, inshallah, I'm gonna end it here, inshallah. And so again, Jazakallah khair for your attendance today. Jazakallah khair, Sarah Ali Khan. May Allah bless you. I know you've been attending regularly for the last 2-3 weeks, and so thank you for coming again. And I'm happy that you're enjoying, the sessions and inshallah taking benefit and learning something that can be, of benefit for us. For those of you who are here, I would ask you kindly to please like the video and subscribe to the page. I will inshallah be uploading a lot of lectures and talks and also course details, on this page. And so please subscribe to the page, inshallah. May Allah bless all of you. All right. Okay. So let's inshallah call it a day. May Allah bless all of you. Jazakumullah khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.